Hello, everybody. Excuse me. Hello, everybody, and welcome back. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture, we're going to continue right where we last left off in our last lecture. In our last lecture, we were discussing the Indus River Valley civilization. It's a very mysterious civilization still to us. We do not really know that much about their social organization. We don't know what they call themselves. We cannot decipher their writing, but we do know they were a pretty impressive civilization. It was a very impressive culture that arose along the Indus River Valley. There was a high degree of standardization. They were very clearly commercially oriented. There is evidence, well, not evidence, but there remains to us the existence of a very large commercial port city on the shores of the Persian Gulf that facilitated trade along the Indian Ocean. At this port site, there's it gets a truly magnificent expanse of commercial dock works, of commercial warehousing, and of course within the cities of the Indus River Valley proper, there are a number of commercially oriented neighborhoods where where we find copper workshops, we find textile workshops. Um, we also even find other finished good workshops, such as stone masonry workers. We find workshops in neighborhoods for potters and other people dabbling in ceramics. So a very impressive civilization. Now this civilization thrives for about 1100 years. It thrives roughly around 3000 BC, and around 1900 BCE it begins to sort of taper off, and by 1500 BCE the major centers, the major sites are abandoned. They are no longer inhabited, and we don't really know why. The prevailing thought throughout most of our study of this culture, of the civilization, was that the area fell because of invasions and incursions from nomadic peoples. That has sort of tapered off in the last couple of decades, and what's been put forward very strongly by a number of researchers and historians and archaeologists has been that there was a cataclysmic environmental change, in that the soil became uh, too too unworkable, that the salinity levels in the salt rose, creating a situation where even though they had these very intricate irrigation networks, they were unable get to achieve the same crop yield to support their large, dense population centers. There's also evidence that the rivers, one of the major tributaries, dried up, and that they were exposed to prolonged drought periods, which facilitated the people simply breaking up and abandoning in these large urban centers. And following the collapse of the Indus River Valley civilization, the great city fell into decay and ruin, and the axis or center point of Indian civilization shifted from around 1500 to 500 BCE. The Vedic and Aryan periods of Indian history bore witness to an explosion of literary texts, but has left behind very little archaeological or material remains. Now, we do not know much about the domestic or industrial pursuits of these peoples, but we do know a great deal about their religious beliefs and their intellectual philosophy due to the large body of written works that they left behind. Around 2000 BCE, groups began to emerge out of South Central Asia, and they began moving to the east and west. This group is known as the Aryans, and the Aryans went east through the mountains of the Hindu Kush, and they reached India by roughly 1800 BCE. And when discussing the Aryans, as it pertains to this group and the history of the group, it is important to keep in mind that we must make a distinguishment between the later misappropriation of the name by the Nazi regime in Germany and the continued misappropriation of the name by neo-Nazi groups that we deal with currently, that we live with currently. Now, the Aryans, the group, now this group was a member of a group of nomadic tribes who spoke an Indo-European language. By 1000 BCE, the Aryans had settled in most of northern India in the river plains. The Aryan migration did not descend into the Deccan Plateau, where other groups who spoke a Dravidian language, who spoke a Dravidian language and derived languages, had settled. In the earlier days of scholarship on the ancient Indian civilization, scholars tried to link the collapse of the Indus Valley civilization with the appearance of the Aryans. They painted the Aryans as the culprits who had perpetrated a sudden destructive assault on the cities in the Indus River Valley. Now, research thus far has suggested that the Aryan migration was done in little waves of small settlements and small bands of newcomers who settled and mixed in with the existing communities. They intermingled over centuries, and this fusion resulted in what is known as Indo-Aryan culture. Now, there's not a lot that we know about the Aryans. We still don't know that much about them. We don't know where they came from, for example. Now, what we do know are the main aspects of their culture and what they contributed to later Indian culture. They brought a new language with them, Sanskrit, a new pantheon, a new religious consortium, not consortium, a new group of gods, a new patriarchal focus which superseded the earlier matriarchal system in India, and a new emphasis on rigid social system with distinct classes. They were originally nomads, and after adopting a sedentary lifestyle, they were no longer inclined to build large cities like the ones in the Indus Valley civilization. The Indo-Aryans did not use bricks to construct their settlements. They did not construct buildings that stood the test of time thusly. What they left behind was pottery and a lot of written works, mainly in Sanskrit, and mainly of a religious nature, and of course epic poems telling the stories of the gods and of heroes. Now, the Aryans appeared to be literate, but they had a very vibrant oral history. The poetry was transmitted orally from generation to generation. Now, the epics that are known to us were written centuries afterwards, and the earliest of these poems are called the Vedas. And the Vedas are thought to have been compiled between 1600 and 1200 BCE. The earliest Veda is the Rig Veda, the verses of knowledge, and it is thought to have been written around that time, around 1600 to 1200 BCE. The Rig Veda consists of 1700 poems, all written in Sanskrit, and the Rig Veda was followed by three more Vedas: the Yajur Veda, the Sama Veda, the Sam Veda, and the Athara Veda. These texts, while having a religious focus, represent significant clues as to what the early Aryan culture was like and what later Indo-Aryan fusion culture was like. The Aryans were organized into two distinct groups: a regional warlord and its retainers. These groups began as nomads. They herded cattle and still preserved elements of their nomadic lifestyles after settling. They combined a little bit of hunting with farming, raiding, and herding all into their society. Now, the Aryans were a warlike culture who had become masters of horse and had really attained a true mastery of chariot warfare, which had, and their chariots had spoked wheels. This gave them an advantage in terms of speed and mobility in combat. The chariots were drawn by teams of one or two horses, and they carried a driver, an archer, and a spearman, the classic trio of any wartime chariot. Now, they wielded bronze axes and bronze swords. In the Vedas, the chariot is seen as the vehicle of the gods, and it raised the status of anyone who could afford one. The Vedas also contain lengthy descriptions of battles which implied that military skill was an important attribute in their culture, in their society. The image that descends to us of the Vedic age is of a warlike, hard knock, patriarchal society, which is really in contrast with the earlier matrilineal, I don't want to say docile, but very sort of peaceful society. We don't have any descriptions of warfare or rigid social classes the from the earlier age, from the Indus Valley civilization age. So it really stands in contrast. Vedic India does. Now, at the time, the Indus Valley civilization, at the time that the Indus Valley civilization was at its height, the Ganges River Valley was heavily forested and not very populated at all. By 500 BCE, it had transformed into a densely populated region filled with urban centers. Small states began to emerge, and they began to wage wars with one another. Now, we do not know the specific politics or historical events during this period, and that leaves us in the dark when we begin to focus on it and we try to interpret it. What we do know about this period and about events that occurred during this period that still impact our life is that the system, the numeral system, currently known as Arabic numerals, and of course the metal, the steel known as Damascus steel, which both originate in India, came about during this time. And Arabic numerals and Damascus steel, they get their name because after the Islamic conquest, this knowledge in India was transmitted westward by the Arabs, hence why we call it Arabic numerals, and hence why we call it Damascus steel. We might as well call it Vedic numerals and Vedic steel. But that's another issue for another time. Now, when discussing Vedic Age India, the most important social development of this period was the genesis of the caste system, in which people are born into specific social classes that they cannot change. The system appears to have arisen and solidified over time, and in incorporating various aspects of existing social behaviors and customs. Now, one thing was certainly drawn upon was the Aryan Varna system, placing persons into four categories. One would be the Brahmins, the top class. The priest, the philosopher, the scholar were all in that class. The warrior class, politicians, soldiers, and civil authorities were in that class. The merchants, the farmers, and the peasantry was next. And at the bottom were the Shudras, the common workers, and the servants. And below them were the untouchables, who were sort of the pariahs of society, who stood outside of the class system. Now, the Shudras lived outside of the towns and had to wear special marks for identification. They could have no interactions with their social betters. The top three classes were known as the twice born, which refers to a ceremony held on the onset of adolescence in which boys were initiated into manhood. And after this ceremony, males from the top three classes were permitted to wear a sacred thread over their left shoulder to represent their status within the community. Now, the Rig Veda contained passages explaining how the Varnas came into existence. Each class represents a part of the original cosmic man's body. The Brahmins were the mouth. The warriors were the arms. The merchants and the farmers were the thighs. And the Shudras came forth to form the feet. So the Shudras were at the bottom of the cosmic man system, at the bottom of the cosmic man's body, and they're at the bottom of the earthly caste system. Now, the caste system provided order in early Indian civilization. It assigned specific roles for classes, and while it is very harsh on the lower classes, it also acted as a welfare structure, since all members of one class were obligated to aid members of the other class who fell on hard times. Now, out of this era developed Hinduism, which is a very complex religion, and it encompasses many practices, many customs and rituals and beliefs that are different from one another. There is no central founding figure in Hinduism. There is no single sacred text, or really any other specific place or group. None of those things are features of Hinduism. At its core, at the core of Hinduism are the Vedas and the epic poems. As time went on, more spiritual aspects of Hinduism came into place, such as the concepts of dharma and karma. Dharma, of course, being the selfless execution of earthly duties, and karma, which is the consequences of your actions. Dharma and karma are fundamental concepts of Hinduism, along with meditation and prayer. Aryan religion focused heavily on sacrifice, be it crops or animals. It is not rooted in the more spiritual, intellectual ideas of Hinduism. It came to be defined by rituals that only the Brahmins could perform, and thus elevated the Brahmins further, which caused resentment. As you could imagine, the elevation of of the Brahmins into a higher into a higher atmosphere would undoubtedly cause friction with the other classes. It really sort of put them on a higher pedestal. The Brahmins the Brahmins would go on to sort of, how do I want to phrase this? They would go on to sort of attract a lot of resentment, and the result of this elevation of the Brahmins was a very pronounced social reaction against these ritual customs, and the result would be the splintering of a splintering of the religious practices in the region, and what would arise would be a various would be various sort of splinter groups from Hinduism, and Buddhism and Sikhism are sort of the descendants of these sort of splinter groups, some of the more well-known descendants of these Hinduism splinter groups. And that concludes my lecture on India and the Vedic Age. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about it. It's a very interesting period. Not a whole lot that I can say on it. And the reason I can't really say that much about it is that we only have their religion and their philosophy, and their religion and their philosophy are already well known to us. Their warfare is still their warfare practices are still well known to us. So I can't delve too deeply into that. But I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you guys found it informative. And as always, hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about it. I am Ted, and I will see you guys next time for another lecture.